Welcome to this Arnall-Culliford knitwear tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to keep track of how many rows you've worked in your knitting. This is really useful for making sure that you work two pieces to the same length, and it can also be handy when you're keeping track of things like increases when you're working a sleeve or waist shaping in a garment. I'm working on the sleeve of my Ola yoke sweater, which is designed by Ella Gordon. I'm using some beautiful Jameson & Smith 2-ply jumper weight yarn. It's shade 366, which is a lovely mixture of purples and blues and yellows and things. And I need to keep track of the number of rounds I've worked because I need to work an increase every 9 rounds in my size. And I use a running thread to keep track of how many rounds I've worked in my knitting. You can tally off in a notebook or use a row counter for keeping track of rounds, but I really struggle with those methods because I can never remember whether or not I've marked off the rounds, and row counters would be far too appealing for the small people who live in my house. So I really love this method because it allows me to be a bit forgetful if I am, and I never have to count more than a few rounds to see where I am. The easiest way to count rounds in your work, I find, is to count on the purl side. If I turn my sleeve inside out, you can see the purl rows of knitting and you can count them. So where the thread goes through the fabric, I can count that above that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rounds, and hopefully there will be 9 in the next section. So there's the thread going through the fabric, and then above that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rounds of knitting again. So I've used the same method in my cuff to keep track of how many rounds of the rib I'd worked. It would be a pain without the thread each time to have to count from the beginning to see how many I've done. So here I've used a running thread every 5 rounds. And again, you can count by looking there at how many rounds there are between the points where the thread goes from one side of the fabric to the other. So if I look now at the top of my knitting, I want to know how many rounds I've worked and whether I need to do another increase now. So the running thread is currently at the wrong side of my work, and I can count that I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the top round is on the needles, so that's the 6th round. So I've done 6 rounds and I'm ready to work the 7th. So I need to work along until I reach the point where the thread is being used. You can have it at the start of the round marker, but I like to have it a few stitches after that so that I can not have to worry about tangling the two things. So here I am, I've reached this point, and if I was on an increase round, if I'd done my 9 rounds, I'd be ready to work the increase round. The way that you mark a round is very, very straightforward. You just take that running thread and pass it between the needle tips before you work the next stitch. So the yarn was at the back and I brought it to the front, and I now work over it, and that traps the thread coming through the fabric. So this wasn't an increase round, but if it was, then that's how I would mark that I'd reached it. And you can see there it going from the other side. If the yarn was hanging at the front of the work already, then you would simply take it to the back between the needle tips as well. As well as allowing you to count your rounds to see whether the next round is an increase or not, you can also see at a glance how many increase rounds you've worked. So the first one was worked straight after the cuff, and you just count the number of times you've passed the thread from one side of the fabric to another. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've worked 6 increase rounds and we're ready to work the 7th one. I hope you found this tutorial useful and that you're now feeling really confident about keeping track of your rows in your knitting. If you'd like to find out more about our tutorials and books, do visit our website acknitwear.co.uk, and thank you very much for watching.